The scent of fresh cedar and stale sweat was the only atmosphere Elias Thorne had ever known. In the quiet, frost-bitten shadows of a small mountain town, his life was measured by the rhythm of the saw during the day and the heavy thud of his fists against a duct-taped punching bag at night. Elias was a carpenter whose hands were calloused by honest labor and scarred by the desperate necessity of the underground fighting circuit. Every swing of his hammer was a prayer for stability, and every punch thrown in those dim, makeshift arenas was a gamble for survival. He didn't fight for glory, he fought for Lily, his younger sister, whose laughter was growing quieter as a rare illness drained the color from her cheeks. The medical bills were a mountain taller than the ones surrounding their home, and the local community center, the only legacy their parents had left behind, was facing foreclosure. One humid evening, in a basement thick with the smell of iron, a stranger watched from the shadows. This was the corporate scout, a man who dealt in human potential and marketability. He saw Elias dismantle a larger opponent with a cold efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. After the match, the scout approached Elias with a proposition that sounded like a dream. He promised the title, a path to infinite wealth, and the power to wipe away every debt Elias ever owed. To Elias, it was the answer to his prayers, a golden ticket to save Lily and their family history. Sarah, his mentor, who had taught him how to strike with intention, watched him pack with a heavy heart. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes that worried her, not fear, but a burgeoning hunger for a world he didn't understand. Elias knelt by Lily's bed, promising her that when he returned, they would never have to worry about money again. He kissed her forehead, his rough hands trembling, and stepped into the sleek black car waiting at the edge of the dirt road. As the mountain peaks faded in the rear-view mirror, the man known as Elias Thorne began to dissolve. The city was a labyrinth of glass and neon, a place where identity was a commodity. Under the scout's direction, the humble carpenter was scrubbed away. They dressed him in tailored suits that felt like armor and taught him how to speak in sound bites. He was no longer Elias, he was the ghost, a mysterious, unstoppable force crafted for the cameras. The transition was jarring. His calloused hands were manicured, his rugged edges smoothed over by publicists. He felt like an actor in a play he hadn't written, yet the luxury was intoxicating. Success came with the sudden violence of a summer storm. His first televised match was a masterclass in brutality. As he stood over his fallen opponent, the stadium erupted. Thousands of voices screamed for the ghost, a name that echoed until it drowned out the memory of his own. The rush of power was unlike anything he had felt in his dusty garage. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the worship. He felt invincible, a god carved from spotlight and granite. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. However, the cost of the crown began to manifest in subtle ways. On the morning Lily was scheduled for a crucial surgery, Elias found himself on a closed set, surrounded by expensive cameras. He was filming a commercial for a luxury watch brand. His phone buzzed in his trailer with calls from Sarah and updates from the hospital, but the director demanded another take. Elias told himself it was for the greater good, that the deal would pay for everything, but as he caught his reflection in the polished surface of a $1,000 timepiece, he barely recognized the man looking back. His eyes, once full of purpose, were now hard, reflecting a hollow ambition he hadn't known he possessed. He looked at his hands, once stained with sawdust, now smelling of cologne. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life. The seasons changed outside the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of his penthouse, but inside, time was measured only by the expensive ticking of the watches he now endorsed as a global superstar. Months had bled into a relentless pursuit of the championship belt. Elias Thorne had become a ghost in more than just his name. The humble carpenter, who once found solace in the scent of cedar, was buried beneath layers of silk and vanity. His phone, once a lifeline to his sister's laughter, had become a source of irritation. Every time a number from home flashed on the screen, he saw it as a heavy tether pulling him back down into a world of scarcity. He stopped answering. He convinced himself that every ignored call was a sacrifice for Lily's future, a necessary silence to maintain the focus demanded of a god of the ring. The final thread of his old life snapped when he authorized an assistant to terminate his relationship with Sarah. There was no phone call, no goodbye to the woman who had taught him how to stand his ground. In her place arrived the corporate coach, a man whose eyes were as cold as a spreadsheet. This new mentor didn't care about the fire in Elias's spirit. He cared exclusively about biometric data and strike velocity percentages. Under this sterile regime, Elias was no longer a warrior. He was a high-performance machine being tuned for a violent purpose. The gym was now a laboratory of white walls and humming machinery, a far cry from the soul-filled garage where his journey began. The reality of his transformation crashed against his doorstep when Sarah arrived unannounced at his penthouse. She looked small against the backdrop of the city's skyline, her worn coat a stark contrast to the minimalist luxury of his living room. Elias stood before her, not as the boy she had raised, but as a marble statue draped in designer labels. When she spoke of the community center's struggles and Lily's longing to hear his voice, Elias felt a flickering spark of guilt that he quickly extinguished. He didn't offer her a seat. Instead, he pulled a checkbook from his pocket and scribbled a figure that would have seemed like a fortune months ago. He handed it to her, telling her to use it to fix things and to stop bothering him during his training camp. The look of heartbreak in Sarah's eyes was a mirror he refused to look into. To him, the money was the resolution. To her, it was a tombstone for the man he used to be. That night, Elias sat in a room filled with the city's elite who toasted to the ghost. Not one person in that glittering hall knew his middle name or the sister whose life hung in the balance. He was surrounded by thousands of admirers, yet he had never been more profoundly alone. His body, too, was beginning to protest. To maintain the inhuman standards set by management, Elias pushed himself into dangerous territory, using experimental methods and medical shortcuts, while ignoring the chronic fatigue that clouded his mind. He was a vessel being emptied of its humanity to make room for more trophies. The final blow to his integrity came with a sponsorship deal. The brand didn't want the story of a mountain carpenter. They demanded a polished narrative that erased his actual roots. The contract required him to lie about his upbringing and effectively ignore his own family history to fit a cold, marketable corporate image. Elias stared at the signature line. For a second he remembered the smell of the garage. Then he remembered the weight of the gold belt. He signed the paper without hesitation. On the eve of the championship fight, a courier delivered a letter from Lily. He saw her childish scrawl on the envelope and felt a phantom ache in his chest. But as his manager entered, reminding him to focus on the gold crown and the glory ahead, Elias looked at the letter as a distraction. He dropped the letter, unopened and unread, into the wastebasket. The ghost was ready for the throne, but the man was gone. The arena was a cathedral of thunder and strobe lights. Elias Thorne stood in the center of it all. His skin shimmered with a fine sheen of sweat, his eyes cold and vacant as he stared across the ring. This was the moment he had sacrificed everything for. He felt nothing but a sharp, clinical focus. The bell rang, a metallic scream that signaled the start of his final ascent to the throne of the fighting world. The match was a symphony of violence. For 3 rounds, Elias traded bone-crushing blows with a man he didn't even know. In the 4th round, a heavy left hook caught him squarely on the jaw. In that split second of concussive darkness, the lights of the arena didn't fade. They transformed. He wasn't in a multi-million-dollar ring. He was back in his dusty garage, the scent of fresh cedar filling his lungs. He saw himself, the Elias who wore grease-stained shirts and had calloused palms, standing by the workbench. That version of himself didn't look at him with pride, but with a profound, quiet pity. The hallucination was a mirror of his lost humanity. He realized then that he wasn't fighting for Lily or for his home. He was fighting for a piece of metal to fill a hole that only love could close. He surged forward, driven by a desperate newfound clarity. He finished the fight with a flurry of strikes that left his opponent motionless, but as the referee raised his arm and the heavy gold belt was strapped around his waist, the roar of the crowd sounded like a funeral dirge. He was the world champion, the pinnacle of the sport, yet an overwhelming sense of grief threatened to drown him. The cameras flashed, capturing the image of a king who looked like he had just lost everything. The weight of the gold felt like lead against his skin. Back in the locker room, the air was thick with the scent of expensive champagne and the chatter of managers calculating their percentages. In the corner, resting on a pile of discarded tape, was the letter he had thrown into the trash the night before. A janitor, recognizing the name on the envelope, had quietly set it aside. Elias opened it with trembling hands. There were no requests for money. No mention of the medical bills he had obsessed over. Lily had simply written about the way the frost looked on the windows and how much she missed the stories he used to tell her while he worked. She didn't want a champion. She wanted her brother. The post-fight press conference was packed with journalists waiting for the ghost to claim his kingdom. Elias sat at the podium, the belt resting before him like a glittering shackle. When the first question was asked about his future, he didn't look at his manager or the corporate sponsors. He took a long, steady breath and stood up. He unbuckled the belt and left it lying on the table, a cold, discarded toy. He announced his immediate retirement to a room of stunned silence, walking away from the lights and the contracts. He drove through the night, leaving the city behind as the neon glow faded into the natural darkness of the mountains. He returned to the small town not as a celebrity, but as a man seeking to rebuild what he had broken. He used his earnings to save the community center and secure Lily's future, but he did so through anonymous channels. The final transformation didn't happen in a ring, but in the quiet stillness of his old garage. Months later, as he worked a piece of oak with a hand plane, Sarah walked in, followed by a much healthier Lily. There were no cameras, no titles, and no ghosts. Elias Thorne looked at his hands, scarred, dusty, and honest, and realized that while he had lost the title of world champion, he had finally regained the only titles that ever truly mattered: brother, friend, and himself.